In the unforgiving heart of the Colorado Rockies, a woman's world was defined by the four walls of her cabin and the silence of the mountains. Stella Caroline believed her life story had already been written, its final chapter a quiet descent into lonely solitude. She was wrong. One storm-lashed night, the wilderness didn't send a threat to her door. It sent a secret. A bleeding giant of a man collapsed on her threshold, a man whose presence would rewrite her past, her future, and the very meaning of the word, home. What she did next would save his life, and summon an entire nation to her door, not with weapons of war, but with songs of marriage. The sky over Shadow Creek Basin had been a bruised, angry purple for hours. Stella Caroline, a woman forged as much by loss as by the harsh mountain sun, secured the last of the shutters on her small, sturdy cabin. The wind was a living thing, a predator that screamed through the pines and clawed at the sod roof. Each gust felt personal, a reminder of her profound isolation. It had been 2 years since the fever took her husband Thomas, leaving her with nothing but this homestead, a stubborn will to survive, and a silence that had become her most constant companion. She was not a large woman, but her hands were calloused, and capable her shoulders set with a resilience that belied her slender frame. As she stoked the fire in the stone hearth, the flames cast dancing shadows that made the single room feel both smaller and more menacing. The world outside was dissolving into a fury of rain and wind. It was on nights like this that the loneliness was a physical ache, a phantom limb where her life with Thomas used to be. A sudden violent crash against the cabin door ripped through the howl of the storm. It wasn't the wind. This was a solid, heavy impact. Stella froze her hand, hovering over the woodpile. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the symphony of the storm. A bear, a mountain lion driven down by the weather. She reached for the heavy iron poker beside the fire, its weight a meager comfort. Another thud, this one weaker, followed by a scraping sound, like dead weight sliding down the rough-hewn planks. Curiosity laced with a potent dose of terror warred with her instinct to stay hidden. But Stella was not a woman who let fear make her decisions. Thomas had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy bar from the door poker held at the ready. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it inward with a deafening crack. Rain and pine needles blasted into the room, extinguishing one of the lanterns and plunging half the cabin into near darkness. And there, framed in the wild chaos of the doorway, was a man. He was a giant. Sprawled half in half out of her cabin, he was bigger than any man she had ever seen. His shoulders were as wide as the doorway itself, his long legs tangled in the mud outside. His hair black as a raven's wing, and plastered to his face and neck, hung in thick, wet strands. He was dressed in finely worked buckskin, now soaked and stained. But it was the stain that held her gaze, a dark, ugly patch spreading across his side and dripping onto her floorboards, mingling with the rain. He was bleeding. Badly. His face was turned toward the firelight, and his features were sharp, noble, and clearly not those of a white settler. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a proud nose. He was a Ute, or perhaps from one of the other tribes that kept to the high country. A wave of primal fear, the kind settlers whispered about around their campfires, washed over her. But then his eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep-set, and filled not with menace, but with an agony so profound it stole her breath. He tried to speak, but only a pained groan escaped his lips before his eyes rolled back and he fell limp. The door banged against the wall, the wind howled, and the fire spat and hissed. Stella stood frozen over the body of a bleeding, unconscious Native American man on her floor. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, bar it, and pray he was gone by morning. Helping him was madness. If his people came looking for him, they might think she had harmed him. If the men who did this to him came looking, they would surely kill them both. She looked at the poker in her hand, then at his face, slack with pain. She saw not a savage, not a threat, but a human being bleeding out on her floor. In that moment, the memory of nursing Thomas through his final fever-racked days rose like a ghost. She had been helpless then. She would not be helpless now. With a grunt of effort that defied the storm, she put her shoulder to the door and forced it shut against the wind, dropping the bar back into place. The cabin fell into a sudden, muffled silence. The storm now a beast raging outside the walls. She was alone. Alone with him. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered to the flickering shadows. "What have I done?" The first challenge was his sheer size. Dragging him fully inside and closer to the hearth felt like trying to move a felled oak tree. Stella's muscles screamed in protest, but she managed inch by painful inch to pull him onto the bearskin rug she kept before the fire. The warmth would fight off the chill that was already setting into his limbs. With trembling hands, she lit another lantern, the steady glow pushing back the shadows. Now she could see the full extent of the damage. His buckskin tunic was torn, and beneath it, a ragged, ugly wound wept blood into the material. It wasn't a knife wound. The edges were too bruised and torn for that. A bullet, fired from a heavy-caliber rifle by the looks of it. It had torn through the flesh of his left side, just above the hip. She prayed it hadn't hit anything vital. For a moment, she felt a wave of nausea, but she pushed it down. She had set Thomas's broken leg, once stitched a deep gash on her own arm. This was worse, but the principle was the same. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She fetched her medical supplies, a bottle of carbolic acid, clean linen, torn from an old shift, her sewing needles, and a small bottle of laudanum. First, she needed to get the wet, cold buckskin off him. It was a struggle, his unconscious weight, a dead anchor. The intimacy of the act, her hands on the bare, cold skin of this stranger, was not lost on her, but it was a clinical, desperate intimacy. His skin was a dark, burnished copper, crisscrossed with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. This was a man well acquainted with violence. But beneath the scars, his body was a marvel of strength, with muscles coiled like thick ropes, even in repose. When she finally cut away the tunic and exposed the wound, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. It was worse than she thought. The bullet had passed through, but it had left a mangled channel of flesh. It was dirty, filled with bits of leather and dirt. Infection would set in within hours if she didn't clean it. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a rag, saving the precious carbolic for the wound itself, and began to clean the skin around the injury. As the raw spirit touched the edges of the wound, the man let out a low guttural moan, his body tensing. His eyes shot open, locking on hers. They were no longer glazed with pain, but sharp with a feral, cornered animal terror. He tried to rise his hand, instinctively going for a knife sheathed at his belt, which she hadn't noticed until now. "Easy," she said, her voice soft but firm, holding up her empty hands. "Easy now. You're safe here. I'm trying to help you." He obviously didn't understand her words, but he seemed to grasp the intent. His eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the barred door, the fire, the woman with the concerned face. He was weak, impossibly weak. His attempt to rise ended in a grimace of pain, and he fell back, his breathing ragged. His gaze remained fixed on her, wary and intense. "I have to clean it," she explained, pointing to his side, "or the fever will take you." She mimed, wiping the wound, her expression earnest. He watched her, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a truce. The next hour was an agonizing ordeal for them both. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, using the precious carbolic acid that stung like fire. He never cried out, but his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords, and his knuckles were white where he gripped the bare skin rug. A constant low groan was the only sound he made. She worked by the flickering lantern light, her fingers deft and sure, stitching the torn edges of the entry and exit wounds with a steady hand. He watched her face the entire time, his dark eyes tracking her every movement, every flicker of concentration and sympathy. When she was finished, she bandaged him tightly with clean linen. She rose her back, aching, her hands stained with his blood. She brought him a tin cup of water, slipping a hand behind his head to help him drink. He drank greedily, his throat bobbing. When he was done, he lay back, his eyes closing in sheer exhaustion. The immediate crisis was over. Stella slumped into the chair by the fire, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. The giant slept, his breathing still shallow, but more regular. The storm continued its assault on the cabin. In the space of a few hours, her world of quiet, predictable solitude had been shattered. She was now the guardian of a wounded warrior, a secret hidden from the world. She looked at his face, peaceful now in sleep, and felt a strange, terrifying pull, not of fear, but of connection. She had touched his pain, and in doing so had bound herself to his fate. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. But inside the cabin the atmosphere remained charged. Her patient, she had no name for him, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Stella was constantly at his side, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his lips to fight the fever and spoonfuls of thin broth to give him strength. During his lucid moments, they existed in a world of gestures and shared glances. He would watch her move about the cabin, his eyes following her, as she kneaded bread, mended a shirt, or checked the snares she kept in the woods nearby. She in turn learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression. A slight tightening of his jaw meant the pain was worsening. A softening around his eyes indicated a moment of peace. There was no room for modesty in the tiny cabin. She tended to his needs, as she would have for a child or a sick husband, changing his bandages, daily keeping him clean. The wound began to heal, the angry redness fading to a healthy pink around her stitches. The fever broke on the 3rd day. She woke to find him sitting up, leaning against the wall, his gaze clear and focused for the first time. He looked at the fresh bandage on his side, then at her. He raised a hand and tapped his chest twice with his fist. "Mako," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, like rocks tumbling in a deep riverbed. Stella felt a small smile touch her lips, a name. It made him reel. "Mako," she repeated, testing the sound. She then pointed to herself. "Stella." He nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Abigail." He said it slowly, carefully, the syllables foreign on his tongue, but strangely beautiful in his deep voice. That small exchange was a turning point. Communication began to blossom in the silence. He pointed to the fire and she supplied the word. She held up a tin cup and he gave her a word in his own tongue, one she couldn't hope to pronounce, but tried anyway, making him give a rare, soft chuckle. He proved to be a keen observer. He watched her reload the spent cartridges for her Winchester rifle, his eyes showing a warrior's understanding, and respect for the weapon. One afternoon, while she was kneading dough, he gestured for the small knife she used for peeling vegetables. Wary but trusting the instinct that had guided her so far, she gave it to him. Using a piece of kindling from the wood box, he began to carve. His large hands, which she knew held immense strength, moved with surprising delicacy and precision. For hours he worked in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of the blade against wood. As he carved, Stella found herself talking to him, filling the silence with the story she had told no one. She spoke of Thomas, of his gentle smile, and big dreams of the journey west from Ohio, of the cruelty of the fever that had stolen him just as they began to build their life. Marco didn't understand the words, but he listened, his eyes never leaving her face, his hands never ceasing their work. It felt good to speak of it, to give voice to the grief she had held so tightly within her. When he finished, he held the carving out to her. It was a small, exquisitely detailed songbird, its head cocked, as if listening, its wings poised for flight. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever held. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded his gaze, holding hers. In that look she saw an understanding that transcended language. He had heard the sorrow in her voice, and had answered it with a thing of beauty. A comfortable domesticity began to settle over them. He was strong enough to walk a little now, and he would watch the wilderness from the cabin's single window, his expression unreadable. She would find him watching her too, with an intensity that made her skin prickle and her heart beat a little faster. A dangerous awareness was growing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the man and woman they were stripped of the prejudices of the outside world. Here, in this isolated pocket of the mountains, they were just Stella and Marco. But they both knew this fragile peace could not last. He was healing. Soon he would be strong enough to leave, and beyond the sanctuary of the cabin walls, the men who put a bullet in him were still out there. A week after Marco's arrival, the world intruded. Stella was outside, splitting firewood, the crisp autumn air invigorating her. Marco was inside, resting. He was still weak, but his movements were surer, his strength returning with visible speed. The peace of the morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses and the gruff voices of men. Her blood ran cold. She peered through the screen of aspen trees and saw two riders emerging from the trail below. They were white men, rough-looking, with stained dusters and rifles slung in their saddles. One was gaunt and weaselly, with pale, restless eyes. The other was broader, with a thick, greasy beard and a brutish set to his jaw. They moved with the swagger of men who took what they wanted. Stella dropped the axe and hurried inside, her heart pounding. "Get down!" she hissed, her voice, a low, urgent whisper. "Hide!" Marco needed no further explanation. The tension in her voice was a universal language. With a fluid movement that belied his recent injury, he slid from the cot and flattened himself in the dark space beneath it, pulling a spare blanket over the gap. It was a poor hiding place, but the only one available. Stella forced herself to breathe, smoothing her apron and trying to quell the tremor in her hands. She stepped back outside, leaning against the cabin wall, as if she'd just been resting her expression carefully neutral. The men reined in their horses a few yards from her, their eyes sweeping over the cabin, the neat woodpile, the small garden. The weaselly one dismounted his boots, crunching on the gravel. "Afternoon, Mom," he said, his voice a sly drawl. His eyes roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Silas Kane. This here's my brother, Jebediah." The bearded one. Jebediah grunted, a greeting, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Stella asked, her tone level, betraying none of the terror she felt. "Just passing through," Silas said, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "Been tracking some game, though not the four-legged kind." He smiled, a humorless stretching of thin lips. "We had a run-in with a Ute buck about a week ago up on the ridge. Big fella. Put a slug in him, but he got away. Figured he might have stumbled down this way. You ain't seen anyone like that, have you? A stray Indian causing trouble?" Stella's heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She could feel Marco's presence, just feet away, could almost hear him breathing. "No, sir," she said, shaking her head. "I've seen no one. It's just me out here." Jebediah squinted at her. "Just you. A woman alone, mighty dangerous." "My husband passed," she said simply. "I manage." Silas Kane took a step closer. He sniffed the air. "Smells like you got stew on the fire, and something else, like herbs, the kind you use for poultices." His eyes narrowed. "You a healer, ma'am. I know a little about country remedies," she said, her voice tight. "For my own use." "Is that so?" Silas's gaze drifted to the ground near the door. Stella's eyes followed his, and she felt a surge of pure dread. There, half-trodden into the mud from the days of rain, was a single dark drop of blood she had missed in her clean-up. Silas pointed at it with the toe of his boot. "Funny kind of game that bleeds on your doorstep, ma'am." The air grew thick with menace. Jebediah swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "I think maybe we should have a look inside your cabin," Silas said, his voice losing its folksy drawl and taking on a hard, dangerous edge, "just to be sure you ain't harboring a fugitive." This was it, the moment where it all fell apart. Stella's mind raced. She could scream run, but they would catch her in seconds. There was only one weapon she had. "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. She straightened up her fear, transmuting into cold fury. "This is my property bought and paid for by my late husband, Thomas Caroline. You have no warrant and no right. If you take one more step, I will take it as a threat against my person, and I will defend myself." She met Silas's gaze without flinching. For a long second, he stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his pale eyes. He had expected a frightened, pliable woman. He hadn't expected steel. He glanced at his brother, then back at Stella. He could push his way in, but it would be messy. Maybe the blood was from a cut, a snared rabbit. Maybe it wasn't worth the trouble. "Feisty one, ain't she, Jeb?" Silas drawled, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. "All right, ma'am. We'll leave you be. For now." He climbed back onto his horse. "But that Ute is worth a bounty. And he's wounded. He won't get far. When we find him, we'll be back. A woman alone shouldn't be so unneighborly." The threat hung in the air, as foul as the tobacco on Jebediah's breath. They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of menace behind them. Stella waited until they were completely out of sight before she stumbled back into the cabin, her legs giving way. She leaned against the closed door, gasping for air. Marco emerged from under the cot, his face a mask of cold fury. He had heard everything. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of gratitude and a fierce, protective anger that startled her. He walked to her, placing a hand gently on her trembling arm. He said nothing, but his touch spoke volumes. In that moment, they were no longer just a patient and a caregiver. They were allies. They had a shared enemy. And Stella knew with chilling certainty that the Kane brothers would be back. The visit from the Kane brothers shattered the insular peace of the cabin. A new urgency settled upon them. Marco knew he couldn't stay. His presence put Stella in mortal danger. She knew it too, but the thought of him leaving now with his wound still healing and his enemies so close filled her with a profound dread. He began to prepare. He tested his strength, walking the perimeter of the clearing, his long strides eating up the ground. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a mournful countdown. He ate everything she put before him, methodically building his reserves for the journey ahead. They spoke more now in their broken language of single words and expressive gestures. He told her of his people, the Talanui, the people of the whispering pines. He described the high valleys where they lived, a place of clear water and ancient trees. He was the son of the chief, which explained his noble bearing and the fine quality of his buckskin. He had been tracking the Cain brothers who had desecrated a sacred burial ground in their obsessive search for gold when they had ambushed him. Stella in turn found herself wanting him to know her, to understand the woman who had saved him. She showed him the faded photograph of her and Thomas, their faces young and full of hope. Marco looked at it for a long time, his expression thoughtful, before meeting her eyes with a look of deep empathy. He understood loss. The night before, he was to leave, a heavy quiet filled the cabin. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. Stella sat mending one of his torn moccasins, her stitches tight, and even her focus absolute. It was a way to keep her hands busy, to keep the tears at bay. Marco watched her, his dark eyes shadowed in the firelight. He had healed remarkably fast. The wound was now a puckered, angry scar. But it was closed. He was still not at his full strength, but he was a formidable man once more. He could survive the journey home. When she finished her work, she handed the moccasin to him. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt, warm and startling, passed between them. She pulled her hand back as if burned her heart leaping into her throat. He didn't move his gaze, holding hers frank and searching. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of the turmoil in her own heart, a powerful unspoken connection that had grown in the fertile ground of shared danger and forced intimacy. It was terrifying, impossible, and undeniably real. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and drew something out. It was a necklace, a single perfectly polished claw from a great bear strung on a simple leather thong. The claw was the size of her thumb, a symbol of immense power and strength. He leaned forward, his presence filling the small space between them, and gently placed it around her neck. The claw felt cool and heavy against her skin. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For courage." Or he touched the bear claw where it rested against her collarbone. Then his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly soft. He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would kiss her. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of profound respect and intimacy that shattered her composure. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine leather and the man himself. "I will come back." He whispered the words, a solemn vow against her skin. "For you." He pulled away, and the moment was broken. The air still crackled with what had passed between them. He left at dawn. He stood at the edge of the clearing, a tall, powerful silhouette against the rising sun. He wore the spare shirt and trousers she had given him, as his own buckskins were beyond repair. He looked back at her, one last time, his hand raised in a gesture of farewell. Then he turned and melted into the forest, as silent as a shadow. Stella stood at her cabin door, the bare claw cool against her skin, and watched until he was long gone. The silence he left behind was different. It was no longer the quiet of solitude. but the hollow ache of absence. The cabin once her sanctuary now felt impossibly large and empty. She wrapped her arms around herself, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He had promised to return, but the mountains were vast, and the Kane brothers were like wolves circling in the shadows. She had no idea if she would ever see him again. 2 weeks passed. The vibrant colors of autumn bled into the stark, muted tones of late fall. A chill wind whispered of the coming snows. Stella's life returned to its familiar rhythms, yet everything was different. Every snap of a twig in the forest made her heart leap with a mixture of hope and fear. Was it Marco, or was it the Kanes? The bear claw necklace never left her neck, a constant, tangible reminder of the giant she had sheltered. The emptiness of her cabin was a constant companion, a dull ache that never truly subsided. She was chopping the last of the season's wood, her breath pluming in the cold air when she felt it, a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the forest's silence. The birds had stopped singing, the squirrels had vanished. An expectant hush had fallen over the basin. Her hand tightened on the axe handle. She scanned the trees, her eyes wide, her senses on high alert. And then she saw them. They emerged from the trees, not with a crash, but with the quiet inevitability of a rising tide. 1 figure then, 2 then, 10 then, 20. They were silent, their moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the pine-needle floor of the forest. They were Marco's people, the Tala Nuit. Men and women dressed in buckskin and adorned with feathers and beads. Their faces were stoic, unreadable, their dark eyes fixed on her and her small cabin. They didn't approach in a threatening line, but spread out, forming a wide, loose circle around her entire homestead. They simply stood there, watching. Stella was trapped in the center of a silent human ring. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. This was what she had feared from the very beginning. They had found him perhaps dead or dying on the trail, and had tracked his path back to her. They thought she was responsible. They had come for revenge. Her mind raced. Her Winchester was inside, but what good would one rifle be against so many? She was utterly, hopelessly surrounded. She stood frozen, the axe feeling heavy and useless in her hand. This was how it ended. Alone, surrounded by strangers who believed she was their enemy. An old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, and his hair streaked with grey, stepped forward. He wore a headdress of hawk feathers, and his bearing was one of unquestionable authority. This must be the chief, Marco's father. Beside him stood a young woman with Marco's high cheekbones and intelligent eyes, her black hair in 2 long braids. The chief raised a hand, not in a threat, but as if to signal the start of a ceremony. And then a sound began. It wasn't a war cry, it was a song. A low, resonant chant started from one side of the circle, picked up by the others. It was a deep, powerful hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air in the ground beneath her feet. It was followed by a woman's voice, rising in a clear, haunting melody that spoke of mountains and eagles, of sorrow and strength. More voices joined in weaving complex harmonies that were unlike any music Stella had ever heard. It was beautiful, mournful, and utterly terrifying. They were singing to her, encircling her. She didn't understand the words, but the sheer, overwhelming power of it washed over her. Was this a death song, a ritual before they took their vengeance? She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white on the axe handle, waiting for the first arrow, the first blow. But it never came. The song continued rising and falling with the rhythm of a great, slow heartbeat. Stella forced her eyes open. The people were not looking at her with hatred. Their expressions were solemn, yes, but also filled with a deep, profound respect. Some of the women were smiling at her gentle, encouraging smiles. The young woman beside the chief stepped forward, her hands held open in a gesture of peace. The chief began to speak, his voice deep and commanding, each word echoing in the still air. He wasn't speaking to his people. He was speaking directly to Stella. The song swelled around her, a wall of sound that was not menacing but embracing. She stood in the center of the circle, utterly bewildered, tears of fear and confusion streaming down her face. She had expected a battle. She had prepared for violence. She had no idea what to do with a siege of song. The world had turned upside down, and she was at the very center of a beautiful, terrifying mystery. The song faded into a respectful silence, leaving the air humming with its echo. The young woman who stood beside the chief walked toward Stella, her steps deliberate and graceful. She stopped a few feet away, her dark eyes kind. "Do you speak our tongue?" the woman asked, in perfect, though accented English. Stella was so stunned she could only shake her head. The woman smiled gently. "I learned some from a missionary in my youth. I am Winona. The great warrior, Mako, is my brother. The man who speaks is our father, Chief Chaitan." The names grounded Stella, pulling her back from the edge of panic. "Mako." She whispered the name, a prayer on her lips. Is he all right?" "He is," Winona confirmed, her eyes shining with pride and relief. "He is alive because of you. He told us everything, how you found him at your door, a breath from the spirit world, how you mended his flesh and stood against the men with metal hearts who hunted him. He called you Ishneawo, the woman with the courage of a mother bear." Stella looked from Winona to the stoic face of Chief Chaitan, then to the dozens of watching faces in the circle. They weren't here for revenge. They were here because of something else, entirely. "I don't understand," Stella said, her voice trembling. "The song—" "Why are you here?" Winona's gaze was direct. "In our way, when a life is saved, a debt is created. Not a debt of goods like horses or blankets, but a debt of spirit, a life for a life. Mako is the son of our chief, a future leader of the Talanuit. His life is not his own. It belongs to the people. By saving him, you have saved a part of us. Such a debt is the most sacred of all." Chief Chaitan spoke again, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. Winona listened intently before translating. "My father says that the law is clear. The debt cannot be ignored. He says your spirit is strong to live alone in these mountains and to show compassion to an enemy of your people. He says you have proven your worth. The debt must be honored. A life must be joined to a life." Winona paused, taking a deep breath, as if to deliver the most crucial line. "Stella Caroline," she said, her voice ringing with formality. "My father, Chief Chaitan of the Talanuit, on behalf of his son Mako, and all our people, asks you to honor this life debt. He asks you to join our tribe. He asks you to become the wife of my brother." The words struck Stella with the force of a physical blow. Wife marriage. She stared dumbfounded at the assembly of people. This wasn't a proposal as she knew it. This was a treaty, a tribal decree. The songs hadn't been a threat. They were an announcement, a marriage song. They had surrounded her not to intimidate her, but to welcome her, to claim her as one of their own, in the only way their culture understood to balance such a profound act. Her mind reeled. She thought of Mako, his quiet strength, the gentleness in his powerful hands, the unspoken promise in his eyes. A part of her heart, a part she didn't even know was still alive, leapt at the thought. But her world was this cabin, these mountains, the memories of Thomas. Their world was one she couldn't possibly comprehend, with laws and traditions that were ancient and alien to her. They weren't asking her to accept a husband. They were asking her to surrender her entire world. This is too much," she stammered, shaking her head. "I am a white woman, a widow. My life is here." "Marco told us of your husband," Winona said softly. "He told us of your grief. We do not ask you to forget him. We ask you to begin a new life. The courage of a mother bear should not be left to wither alone in a winter cabin." Chief Chayton held up a hand, and one of the men brought forward a beautiful white doe-skin dress, exquisitely decorated with intricate beadwork and porcupine quills. Another brought a horse, a spirited pinto with a finely tooled saddle. They were gifts. A bride price, she realized with a jolt. The choice was laid before her, as stark and real as the mountains around them. It was a choice between the safe, lonely silence of her past and a future so terrifyingly unknown and yet so vibrantly alive it stole her breath. She looked at the stoic, hopeful faces of the Talanuit. She looked at the gifts they offered. And she saw him in her mind's eye, his forehead pressed against hers, whispering a promise. "I will come back for you." He hadn't been speaking of a simple visit. He had been speaking of this. But before she could form an answer, before she could even process the cataclysmic shift in her destiny, a new sound cut through the air, the ugly, familiar crack of a rifle shot, followed by a curse shouted in English. The Kane brothers had returned. The world seemed to hold its breath. The chief's proposal, a monumental offer that sought to rewrite Stella's entire existence, hung in the cold, still air between them. The faces of the Talanui were turned toward her, a silent sea of solemn expectation. In that moment, she was the axis upon which two worlds pivoted. The past a lonely cabin filled with ghosts and silence, the future an unknown path with a nation of strangers who offered her a home, and a man who had already captured a part of her soul she thought long dead. Her lips parted, though what sound might have emerged she would never know. For a new sound ripped through the sacred quiet. It was not the whisper of wind through pine, but the clumsy, brutal crash of shod horses and the grating sound of angry, familiar voices. The sacred circle was broken by a profane intrusion. Silas and Jebediah Kane burst into the clearing, their mounts trampling the delicate forest floor. Their faces unshaven and flushed with avarice were masks of triumphant cruelty. They had not stumbled upon this scene by accident. They had been tracking the Talanui, and the sight of them all gathered vulnerable in the open was a bounty hunter's dream. Well, looky here. Jeb Silas Kane's voice was a greasy stain on the pristine air. He pulled his horse to a halt, the animal skittish and wild-eyed. "Looks like your little pet came home, ma'am." And he brought the whole damn family. He laughed a short, ugly bark and unslung his heavy rifle, the motion slick with practiced menace. "Must be a party. Don't mind if we join." The reaction of the Talanuit was instantaneous and fluid. There was no panic, only a disciplined, dangerous shift. The warriors who a moment before had been singers and observers became a living wall. Bows were drawn with a sound like sighing branches, the arrowheads glinting like deadly promises. The few who carried old trade muskets leveled them, their expressions hardening into grim resolve. They were outmatched by the Kanes' repeating rifles, but they stood as one, an unbreachable line of flesh and courage. Chief Chayton's face was an unreadable mask of granite, his hand held up in a gesture that commanded his warriors to wait. Silas's sneer widened as his gaze swept over them. "Think a few sticks and arrows are going to scare me. We're here for the buck who trespassed on our claim." His eyes, small and predatory, locked onto Chief Chayton. "And for the bounty the government pays for every hostile scalp. Hand over the big one, and we might just let the rest of you walk away from this little clearing. Might. It was a lie as thin and sharp as a shard of glass, and every person there knew it. The Canes saw not a people, but an obstacle. Before the chief could respond, a figure stepped through the line of warriors. It was Marco. He was no longer the wounded, vulnerable man who had collapsed on Stella's floor. Dressed in the full regalia of a warrior, an eagle feather tied in his dark hair, he was the embodiment of his people's strength and pride. But as he emerged, his first glance was not for the Canes, but for Stella. His dark eyes met hers across the clearing, and in them she saw 1,000 questions, a world of concern for her safety. Then he turned his attention to the men who had tried to kill him, and his expression became one of absolute chilling cold. "You are the trespassers." Silas Kane Marco's voice was not loud, but it carried a resonant power that silenced the clearing. His English was precise, honed by the same missionary who had taught his sister. "You foul the water and scar the earth for your yellow metal. You shattered the sacred stones of our ancestors' resting place. Your presence here is a poison. Your time is done." Silas let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Big words from a man I already put a hole in once. You talk a good game, but you bleed just like anyone else. This time I won't miss." He began to bring his rifle to bear his target clear. And in that frozen instant, Stella saw it all. The two paths, the two worlds were no longer an abstract choice. They were here in her clearing in the form of these men. The Kane brothers were the worst of her world. The greed, the casual cruelty, the belief that everything and everyone could be bought or broken. They were the rot that festered in the heart of the so-called civilized world. And Marco, his people standing behind him, represented everything she had lost, and secretly yearned for honor community, a fierce connection to the land, and a willingness to die for something more than gold. The proposal from Chief Chaitan was no longer a question of marriage. It was a question of allegiance. Who was she? Was she the frightened widow, a passive victim of fate? Or was she the woman who had faced down a blizzard, a bleeding giant, and her own profound loneliness? She wasn't just choosing a man. She was choosing her soul. The decision was not made in her mind. It was an explosion in her blood, a visceral, undeniable command from the deepest part of her being. She moved. She turned and ran, not away into the trees, but directly toward her cabin. The sudden movement drew a surprised shout from Silas, but no one fired. Her action was too bizarre, too unexpected. She burst through the door, her feet knowing the worn floorboards by heart. Her eyes went right to the pegs above the mantel. The Winchester rifle, her constant companion through 2 lonely winters, felt cool and solid in her grasp. The weight of it was familiar, an extension of her own will. With a practiced fluid motion she had performed 1,000 times, she levered a round into the chamber. The shunk click of the mechanism was the sound of her choice being locked into place. She was back outside in a heartbeat, the afternoon sun glinting off the rifle's long barrel. The scene was as she'd left it, a tense tableau of impending violence. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call out a warning. She brought the rifle butt to her shoulder, sighted down the barrel, and fired. She did not aim at Silas or Jebediah. Her bullet was not for them. Her bullet was a declaration. It struck the earth a mere foot from the stamping hooves of Silas's horse. The report of the Winchester was a clap of righteous thunder in the tense silence, a sound that was wholly and shockingly American. The horse, already on edge, screamed in terror and reared its powerful legs, flailing at the air. Silas, caught completely off guard, was thrown from the saddle like a child's doll, landing in a heap with a strangled cry of pain and surprise. "Get off this land." Stella's voice rang out, sharp and clear, and full of a power she had never known she possessed. She worked the lever again, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one, the rifle now aimed squarely at Jebediah's chest. "This is my home. These people," she swept her gaze over the Tala Nuit, "are my guests. You are not welcome here." The clearing was plunged into a stunned, absolute silence. The Kane brothers stared at her, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and fury. The Tala Nui warriors looked on, their mouths agape with awe. Even Mahko, for a brief second, seemed frozen by the raw power of her action. This quiet, gentle healer, the woman who had stitched his wound and spoken of her lost husband with such sorrow, was also a lioness, fierce and unflinching, wielding a weapon of thunder to defend them. A slow, blazing look of pride lit his face. She had given her answer. It was not spoken in the Tala Nuit tongue or in English. It was spoken in gunpowder and fire. She had chosen her side. Jebediah, seeing his brother sprawled on the ground, finally broke from his stupor. Panic and rage warring on his brutish face, he fumbled to raise his own rifle. He was far too slow. Faster than the eye could follow, an arrow hissed from Chief Chaitan's bow. It did not seek flesh. It struck the wooden stock of Jebediah's rifle with a solid thwack, the force of the impact splitting the wood and sending splinters flying. The gun was ruined. In that same instant, Mahko exploded into motion. He closed the distance between them with the devastating speed of a striking panther, slamming his shoulder into Jebediah and driving him clean off his horse. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs, the fight over, before it had truly begun. Silas scrambled for his fallen rifle, but two Tala Nuit warriors flowed from the line, their movement silent and economical. They were on him before he could touch the weapon, one seizing the rifle, while the other twisted his arm behind his back with painful, inescapable efficiency. Within 30 seconds, the violent intrusion was over. The Kane brothers were disarmed, subdued, and held captive, their blustering threats reduced to pathetic sputtering curses. Stella stood her ground, the Winchester still held at the ready, her heart hammering against her ribs like a war drum. The sharp, clean scent of burnt gunpowder filled the air. Marco rose, hauling the dazed Jebediah to his feet. He looked across the clearing at Stella, and the look that passed between them was a bond stronger than any spoken vow, more intimate than any touch. It was a look of shared battle, of absolute trust, of a partnership forged and sealed in a crucible of violence. Chief Chaitan walked slowly toward her. He stopped and looked not at her face, but at the rifle she held. His old warrior's eyes showed no fear, only a deep professional appreciation. He looked from the weapon to her eyes, which were clear and steady. He gave a single solemn nod. Then he turned to his people and spoke, his voice booming with pride and finality. Winona moved to Stella's side, her own eyes shining with tears of respect. She translated her father's words, her voice soft but triumphant. He says the law of the life debt is a law of the spirit. He says your spirit has now spoken. The woman with the courage of a mother bear has protected her young. She has defended her new family. The debt is honored. The choice is made. The story of Stella Caroline and the giant she sheltered didn't end with the capture of the Kane brothers who were justly delivered to the authorities in a distant fort. Nor did it end with a grand wedding ceremony. Instead, it truly began in the quiet days that followed. It began with Stella packing away her old life, carefully wrapping the faded photograph of Thomas, not as a goodbye, but as a treasured chapter of a finished book. It began with her mounting the pinto horse, dressed not in the white doeskin, but in her own sturdy traveling clothes, a woman choosing her own path. It began with her riding away from the silent cabin, not as a captive, but as a willing partner, riding beside Marco toward the high valleys of the Talanwit. Her new life would be a language she had to learn, a culture she had to embrace, and a love she had to build day by day. She was no longer just Stella Carolyn, the lonely widow. She was Ishna Awo, a bridge between two worlds, her heart finally truly home. Thank you for listening to this tale of the untamed West, where courage and love could rewrite even the most solitary of destinies. If this story captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who loves a good old-fashioned romance with a twist. And for more stories that bring the past to life, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more journeys to take together. Until next time, may your own stories be filled with unexpected courage and daring love.